I'm Juliette Morris. The Kray twins are probably the most infamous gangsters ever to have stalked the streets of London. In Scenes of Crime today, we visit the Blind Beggar pub in East London, where in 1966 a murder took place that heralded the beginning of the end of their reign. But first to a remote railway bridge where a gang of modern-day highwaymen pulled off a theft so massive it's become a legend. On a warm summer's night in August 1963, this lonely and windswept stretch of railway in Buckinghamshire was the scene of a spectacular and unprecedented crime. The plot was so incredible and the amount of money involved so huge that it immediately became known as the Great Train Robbery.
The reaction of the police at all levels was almost disbelief. A staggering figure, eventually amounting to 2.6 million, had been stolen, and not only, of course, the money, but the train as well. I think it was the first time that a train had actually been nicked in the furtherance of a theft.
Those who worked on the railways were taken completely by surprise and were staggered by the scale of the crime. Retired foreman Fred Bateman acknowledges the skill behind the robbery.
Well, it was a well-studied, a well-thought-out project. Although it's a busy main line, the busiest in the country, if we just look around ourselves, it's very isolated, it's an isolated part of the country. The bridge served their purpose adequately, no interference from anyone coming about. No, it was a well-thought-out spot.
The target of the attack was the Glasgow to London overnight Royal Mail train, as John Woolley, who just joined the Buckinghamshire Constabulary, recalls.
I think it was pretty much an open secret that large amounts of money were always carried on the night mail trains.
On the night of the 8th of August, a train with a particularly large cargo was hurtling down the line towards Euston. In a carriage known as the high-value package coach, postal workers were sorting the registered mail that contained the hard cash. But the train never got further than this bridge.
This is what is known as Bridego Bridge. Officially, it's over Bridge 127 on the West Coast Main Line. This bridge now is known as Train Robbers Bridge.
Once they got the train down to Bridego Bridge, they were working to a very precise timetable. The unloading gang was waiting down there for them, and as soon as the train came to a rest, they smashed their way into the high-value coach with a selection of iron bars, felling axes and sledgehammers. The poor old postmen inside the high-value coach, sorting out the mail, were taken completely by surprise. The robbers then removed 120 sackfuls of registered mail. That's 2.5 tons of registered mail. And they then passed that hand to hand in a human chain from the high-value coach down to where their vehicles were waiting underneath Bridego Bridge.
As soon as they got what they wanted, the robbers disappeared into the night.
Well, the alarm was initially raised by the mail train guard, who made the report from Cheddington railway station. And a little bit like perhaps the game of Chinese whispers, the message that starts off is not necessarily the one that reaches the end of the line. When officers were sent out by the Bucks headquarters from Aylesbury to go to Cheddington, it wasn't at all clear what it was that they were going to attend.
I don't think the reality of the deed it really soaked in until later in the day. Even the boss, Mr. Dodds, I phoned him and told him that there'd been a misdemeanor, the mail train had been robbed, and he jokingly said, "Oh, Robin Hood strikes again."
When the police arrived at the scene, they found that the engine and front carriages had been detached from the rest of the train and driven to Bridego Bridge to be looted. But how had the train been halted? It soon became clear that the answer lay further up the track, at a place called Sears Crossing.
This bridge, over Bridge 129, is the very bridge that it's assumed the robbery, most of the robbery was planned. In 1963, the layout of this area was entirely different. There was a signal about 300 yards along the track. This was the signal used for the great train robbery.
On the night of the robbery, this signal was showing green, which would have allowed the train to pass. To stop it, one of the robbers obscured the green light and hot-wired another so that it would show red.
It wasn't exactly rocket science, because all he'd done was to shut off the green light with this old glove and then just connected up the other bulbs with the nest of batteries, the wire and the crocodile clips. So it was a simple enough process that anybody could have worked out. But it was a key task. If you don't stop the train, the whole thing is going to collapse there and then.
But the plan went like clockwork, and just after 3 a.m., the train arrived at Sears Crossing and came to a halt at the red signal. The robbers climbed on board, and the driver was hit over the head. They then uncoupled the engine and the high-value package coach and drove on down the line to Bridego Bridge. Clearly, it had been meticulously planned. The hunt was on for the perpetrators.
My sergeant down at my parents' station at Wadston phoned me up and asked me if I knew the location of Leatherslade Farm, because, he said, we'd got an inquiry to carry out there which had originated at the mail train incident room. So you can imagine that now I was all ears. I was going to be brought in on what Fleet Street was calling already the crime of the century. The sergeant and I went down to Leatherslade Farm. It was a farm that was looking a bit sorry for itself, a bit down at heel. We had a walk round the yard and quickly spotted that there were 2 Land Rovers parked in each of 2 small garages. And here my suspicions were immediately aroused, because I noticed that the registration plates on both of those Land Rovers was exactly the same. Now clearly this could not be right, and so certainly there was at least the seed of a suspicion that something was not well down at Leatherslade Farm. The real clincher, of course, came when we decided that we should make a quick but thorough search of the premises just to make sure that there was indeed nobody else in the house. And it was during the course of that search that I spotted, in an alcove off the kitchen area, a trapdoor in the floor. And as I lifted that trapdoor, I could see steps going down into what was quite clearly the house cellar. And I only went down the first 2 or 3 of those steps, and even in the half light of the cellar, I could see that the cellar was absolutely crammed full of bulging sacks of something or other. As the top of that mail bag flopped open, I could see parcel wrappers, banknote wrappers, all bearing the names of the famous High Street banks. And in that instant, everything changed. This was no longer just a tuppenny halfpenny inquiry that we'd been given to carry out, no longer just an empty farmhouse that we were checking over. I think it registered with me instantly the direct connection between this place and the raid on the mail train the previous week. And I think in that instant I realised that I was in the robbers' hideout. And just by talking to you now about it, I can remember how my heart was pounding as I went back and shouted back up to my sergeant, "Come and see what I found."
The crime of the century turned out not to be the perfect crime after all. The robbers left fingerprints all over the farm. In a few months, most of the gang were tracked down. Several became household names, including Ronnie Biggs and Buster Edwards. But gang leader Bruce Reynolds managed to evade capture for 5 years. The main trial began in January 1964 in Aylesbury. The 30-year sentences that were handed down to several of the men were totally unprecedented, astonishing even the police. And in a further shocking instalment, Ronnie Biggs escaped from Wandsworth Prison after only 15 months, eventually resurfacing in Brazil, where he's been ever since. The great train robbery and the theft of over £2.5 million at Bridego Bridge has now become the stuff of legend, and it seems it'll never be forgotten.
I think it will be handed down from one generation to another. That was Train Robbers Bridge. because the great train robbery has been immortalised both in the deed itself and with films that were made.
It's just something that has captivated the minds of the public. It was styled the crime of the century, and I think most people still regard it as such.
The remote Bridego Bridge is now forever linked to one of Britain's most daring robberies. In a moment, another inconspicuous setting, an East End pub, which gained legendary status thanks to an unwelcome visit by the notorious London gangsters, the Krays twins. Welcome back. I'm Juliette Morris. In the 1960s, the East End of London was the heart of gangland Britain, and the characters that made that heart beat were the notorious Krays twins. Within their patch, there was a pretty ordinary pub, but one that would ultimately be the scene of their downfall. In the centre of London's East End, on the Whitechapel Road, stands the Blind Beggar public house. Today it looks much like any other watering hole. But in 1966, a fatal visit from one of the infamous Krays twins earned it a place in British criminal history. Colin Fry was a confidant of twins Ronnie and Reggie and has written several books about them. He recalls the influences that affected the way they ran their gangland empire.
The Krays loved anything American. They loved American clothes, American cars. The East End of London they called the Wild West. Ron Kray idolized Al Capone. When he found out that Al Capone had a barber come to his house every morning and shave him, Ron Kray said, right, that's for me. It was at this time in the early 60s, mid-60s, that the Krays really began to dominate the criminal underworld. The Krays wanted power, and they maintained that power through sheer, unadulterated fear.
From humble beginnings, the Krays built a thriving criminal business. With the backing of their gang, known as the Firm, they had total control over their East End manor. But that was about to change. The dispute that was to end so violently at the Blind Beggar was triggered by a shootout at a South London nightclub called Mr. Smith's.
There were various members of some of the London gangs present that night at Mr. Smith's. Nobody really knows what happened and why it happened, but there was a shootout. The only man killed that night was Dickie Hart, and he just happened to be a member of the Kray gang. This became personal. The only person to walk away that night unscathed was George Cornell. George Cornell was a nasty piece of work. He'd been in jail previously, grievous bodily harm. He'd attacked a woman with a knife. This was a guy who dealt in pornography. He ran slot machines. He did anything. He knew the Krays well. He'd worked for them at a time. But now he was an enforcer for the Richardson gang. The Krays had a real dislike for George Cornell. He'd deserted them. He'd gone over to a rival gang. This was a person they couldn't trust, and they wanted him out of the way forever.
On the 9th of March, the evening after the shootout, the Krays went to one of their local pubs for a drink.
The building here used to be the Lion Public House. It was better known to the Krays as the Widows because it was run by a widow known as Madge. It was here that Ron and Reg Kray got news that George Cornell was on Kray turf drinking at the Blind Beggar. As far as Ron Kray was concerned, it was red rag to a bull. He grabbed his driver, Scotch Jack Dixon, and his minder, Ian Barry, and hot-footed it out.
The quiet evening was about to explode in violence.
Ron Kray didn't go straight to the Blind Beggar. First, he came here to 178 Valence Road. The house doesn't exist anymore, but this is where it was. This was the family home, and to the Krays and to the Firm, This was known as Fort Valence, and this is where Ron Kray kept his arsenal of guns.
Ron chose a semi-automatic pistol from Fort Valence and headed for Whitechapel Road.
Did he mean business? You bet he meant business. Ron Kray only had a gun in his pocket for one reason, and that was to shoot somebody.
Armed and dangerous, Ron arrived at the Blind Beggar. Current landlord Bill Scarborough takes up the story.
Since the 60s, the whole layout of this pub has changed dramatically. In the 60s, there was an opening here, or an entrance here, which came through as a passageway, which ran along to the back of the house, which, as you see, the natural line you can see through, and in through that door and through the back. You can also pick up with the beams of the bar, which would tell you the shape of the bars as they were in the 60s. This area here was the public bar, or the lads' room, the games room, where they would play darts, cards, dominoes, things that boys did in those days. And if you look around again, you'll see that the bar goes round to the right, and with more beams you'll see that this bar along here was the saloon bar, which where the people, perhaps the younger set, would go and enjoy their beer. As we move down through this bar, we can come and we arrive down to this corner, which is the area where George Cornell was sitting on that fateful evening in the 60s when he got shot.
The story as I heard it, and I got it straight from the horse's mouth, George Cornell was sitting here with his friend Albie Woods having a quiet beer. The door opens. It's Ron Kray. Cornell looks up, sneers sarcastically. Look who's here. Ron walks across the room, takes out a 9mm Mauser handgun, and without saying a word, he simply shoots Cornell in the head. The barmaid just put a new record on the jukebox. It was the Walker Brothers, The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore. The story goes, it got stuck. It kept playing anymore. Quite ironic, but true.
The tale swiftly became legend.
If I was to believe every person that I've spoken to since I've been here, that I was here the night that George Cornell was shot, we'd have enough customers to fill the Albert Hall. The most common question that we get asked from the staff and by myself is that where exactly was George Cornell shot? And the standard reply that we have is in the head.
Scotland Yard put one of its top detectives onto the case of the murder of the Blind Beggar, but the pub didn't give up its secrets easily.
Within hours, the whole of the East End knew Ron Kray had shot and killed Cornell. But nobody was talking. They weren't silly. The firm was around here. They were getting people to stay quiet. Everyone knew what would happen to them. There was half a dozen people, no more. Everybody was frightened. When the police arrived, they questioned the barmaid. Surely she'd seen the shooting. But at the identity parade, she couldn't pick Ron Kray out. Again, it was pure fear. She knew she had to be quiet. No one here wanted to say a word.
In the end, the long arm of the law caught up with the twins. They were arrested in May 1968 and stood trial at the Old Bailey.
The Blind Beggar incident is probably the most significant of any incident involving the Krays. The rules changed in that one split second it took to pull that trigger. Ron Kray rewrote the rules. The law had to close in. The net was tightening. Everything changed from that night.
Both twins received sentences designed to keep them in prison for at least 30 years. Ronnie died in 1995. Reggie, 5 years later. Yet after all this time, rumours are still rife as to the real motive for the murder.
Legend has it that the reason why Ron Kray shot George Cornell is because Cornell had called him a fat puss. But I had the chance to ask Ron Kray that question. Why did you kill George Cornell? He said, simple, he was on my turf. He had to die. The big question in the whole saga of what happened here at the Blind Beggar was why George Cornell was here that night. Nobody really knows. There'd been a gang fight at Mr. Smith's club down in Catford the night before. Cornell was the only one of the Richardson gang to walk out of that. He came here the following evening, right around the corner from Ron Krays. Why on earth did he show up here at the Blind Beggar? Some people say he was visiting people over at the hospital, those who'd been injured the night before at the shootout at Mr. Smith's. But what was he really doing here? I think he was flaunting the fact that he was a survivor. He was calling Ron Kray out, and Ron knew it.
It's many years since the shooting, but the Blind Beggar still remains famous for more than just its beer.
The thing that surprises me most is the amount of youngsters that have heard about this and been told about it, have read about it, that seem to have this morbid interest in it. And people that weren't even born in the 60s seem to be interested. And it certainly has put us on the tourist map for people to come in and observe the scene of where this dastardly deed occurred.
Well, who'd have thought a pub at a railway bridge could be the settings for such extraordinary crimes? Join me, Juliette Morris, next time for more Scenes of Crime.